Hello, welcome to this GFM talk on assessment for learning. Can I encourage you to share this link with other colleagues so that there's a consistency of message about assessment for learning, so that as a MAT, you can all get behind using the same techniques and having the same knowledge. I think that will really help progress to be as effective and quick as we can. Assessment for learning isn't new, but I need to make a distinguishing difference between assessment for learning and assessment of learning, because those two things, for a start, people get in a muddle. So assessment of learning is summative assessment that happens at the end of a block or halfway through a block of learning, where you want to have a benchmark. What did the children learn? What did the students get out of this period of time? Summative assessment is usually often done by exam. It's given a grade, a score, and that's assessment of learning. Assessment for learning is something very different, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Assessment for learning is something that's expected and necessary every single lesson with every single class that you teach. Without assessment for learning, it's impossible to do adaptive teaching, where we scaffold the learning to meet students where they are. So whatever your benchmark knowledge is of assessment for learning, or however well you think you use it, I'm going to ask you now to be open-minded and have a listen to the why we need it, just to make sure it's something that you know you're using effectively. The first thing I would say about assessment for learning is when children come into your room and you're ready to teach, you have to know what they've already learnt. You have to know what your school has provided for them earlier this year, last year, the year before, where this topic lies on the curriculum. You need to know what you expect the students to already know. For great curriculum planning, you need to know what the students have experienced in the key stage before this one. So if you're teaching in Key Stage 3, you really need to know what the Key Stage 2 curriculum looks like to know if you are adding new knowledge or if you really are starting from the beginning. Again, if you're in Key Stage 2, you need to know what the Key Stage 1 teachers have done. Once you've established that and you know what should have been covered on a curriculum, of course, that's very different to knowing what students have retained and know and can use and can apply, but you know what's been covered. To make learning really effective, the first thing we need to do is pause and activate their memory in their brain to be able to use the correct vocabulary and be stimulated to get us back into that place where they're thinking about the relevant things. Easiest way to do this is a keyword box. It's not a keyword box of new vocabulary that they haven't come across yet because you're about to move their learning on. This is about the basic vocabulary that they need in order to access their memories. If I were doing this with you now and we were looking at key vocabulary to do with assessment for learning, I would probably put a keyword box up that said formative, summative, recall, schema, Bloom, self-assessment, peer assessment, plenary, criteria. And I think all those words are words that you should know to be able to access your memory on assessment for learning. What I would then do is, in just a sentence, I would refresh your mind to say what those things mean. So formative assessment, low stakes, ongoing assessment of short, small chunks of learning. summative assessment, higher stake, exam, graded, scored, recall, short and long term, what students know, Bloom, a set of vocabulary which is ordered on difficulty, self and peer assessment, a way of students looking at their own work or work of classmates that have to be measured against a given criteria. A criteria is a list of statements that students have either succeeded in or not succeeded in. Plenary is a time of a lesson, traditionally the end, but doesn't have to be, where you are summing up the learning that's happened in a period of time. So I would expect you to do that kind of activity with students so that you haven't taught them all this stuff new, but you've just refreshed their memory. They just know, oh yeah, I remember doing it with this teacher, that teacher at this school. I was away for that lesson, but I've understood what you've said. So we're all starting with fresh knowledge. If when students come into your room, you decide that you're just going to start again anyway. So I'm a science teacher by trade. If students come into my room and on the curriculum map today it says the atom and we're learning about the atom, if I just decide that I am going to ignore anything that any other teacher has done, what they've done in Key Stage 3, any science they've done before at junior school, or anything their parents might have taught them or they've picked up through books and TV, then what we do is teach students how learning to learn doesn't matter. They don't have to recall it because they know you're going to go through it all right from the start all over again. And do you know what? When they get their teacher next year, the same thing's going to happen. They're just going to get all that learning right from the beginning. So they don't develop those skills of learning to learn. And learning to learn skills are independent skills, which are the things we need them to know to transition into being great citizens after school. Okay, enough of the theory. That was all about why it's important that we have information on what students know and that we're not just teaching everybody the same thing regardless. So, what is assessment for learning? It's a pedagogical framework for learning, which happens with lots of different techniques. Assessment for learning isn't the technique, that's just the technique that mobilizes assessment for learning. It helps teachers and students collect and organize information about learning to enable further learning. That's the bit that matters. We find out what students have learnt, or the student finds out what they know in order to show their next steps for learning. Why do we do it? Because students can only be experts with the knowledge that they've got. They can't make it up. They can't guess it. We need to identify what students know, because only then can we sequence the next steps of learning. 3 things to remember is that assessment for learning checks the links that students can make on what they know now and what they're going to know, what they've learnt in another subject, and how they can apply it to yours. So first of all, it's links. Secondly, assessment for learning highlights gaps in knowledge that need filling. They've switched schools, they were away, they had COVID, they weren't listening, they had a different teacher that wasn't an expert in the subject, they have a misconception that wasn't picked up, will then be the third thing that assessment for learning does. Links, gaps, and misconceptions. Of the class? No, of the individual. The point of assessment for learning is that it is of the individual student and what they actually know. So when do we find out what students know? We need to find out what they know before a lesson or a topic, during a lesson or a topic, and after a lesson or a topic. Let's break that down. How do you know what they know before a lesson? So we're coming in, I'm doing my lesson on atoms. When's the best time to find out what they already know about atoms? It definitely isn't at the start of my lesson, because I've already planned that lesson. And this is one of those where I see teachers carry on regardless. Oh, you know about atoms. Well, we're doing it anyway because I've planned it. So that's not a great time to find out. One of the best times to find out, especially if you're moving on to a new topic, is at the end of the lesson before. I don't mean with 2 minutes to go, where the students are ready to walk out the door, so they'll just tell you whatever it is you want to know. What I mean is the last 15 minutes of the lesson, a chunk of learning time, is introducing a new topic by finding out what do they already know about it, posing a question, posing a thought bubble. Back in the day, we used bubble maps. What do you know? How do you know it? What do you know about an atom? How do you know that? I know that atoms have got electrons. How do you know? Because Mrs. Jones taught me last year. All of those things, what keywords do you know about a topic? You can then collect in at the end of the lesson and use all of that information to either group students according to where their knowledge is, and or use it for your future planning to know where you start. Of course, that would be a good time to have done your keyword box, so they're not starting with, oh, I don't remember, that was too long ago. Actually, this flipped learning, as they used to call it, of getting students ready for the next lesson by offering a suggestion or a homework or a task that opens up the next step of learning, the next sequence of learning, is really good practice. Concept cartoons. If you Google that, you can find concept cartoons on virtually everything. What does that look like? Well, if you don't want a written task at the end of a lesson to open the new topic, you can put a concept cartoon up. And there are speech bubbles that debate a topic, and the children in groups talk about it. And the bubbles on the concept cartoon are always a bit controversial. They've got errors in them, so you can listen to see if children are picking up on the errors, and it refreshes their knowledge. So a concept cartoon that I've used in training recently was 10.0 times 10, and it has children debating how to do that. Some children say the decimal point jumps one space to the right. Another child says the digits move one place to the right. Clearly, both of those things are wrong. The decimal place jumps to the left. Now what we're doing is opening up misconceptions that decimal points are allowed to move. They're a replacement. They're not allowed to move. But just listening to the children, the students discussing it, will inform your knowledge of their thoughts and their misconceptions. So that's a really good way of doing it. Another way I like to use is odd one out. I would find 4 pictures to whet their appetite, give a bit of awe and wonder. So if I was doing a lesson on the atom, I would have maybe a cartoon picture of an atom. I would have a picture of a rocket. I would have a picture of the sun. I would have the picture of a nuclear power station. They're all vaguely linked into my topic area. There isn't an odd one out, but I ask the student what's the odd one out, and they'll give me answers. They'll say, oh, it's the atom because it's the only one that we can't see. Interesting. They'll say, oh, it's the rocket because it's the only one that we can see that has got flames coming out of the end of it. They'll say, oh, the sun because it's the biggest thing. It doesn't matter what they say. And they can get used to knowing that there isn't a right answer. But in them having that discussion with you, all of a sudden, you're making mental notes of who can add what to this knowledge bank before you start the next lesson or the next piece of learning on your topic. Well, the position you're in at the moment is that teachers don't consistently check what pupils understand before moving on to the next area. That's what's seen when we drop into lessons. We know that leaders haven't ensured that staff routinely check for gaps in pupils' knowledge in order to adapt the teaching before moving on to new knowledge. What this means is some students really struggle to connect important ideas together. This is moving on to adaptive teaching and individualized learning, which is a non-negotiable. That is what we should be doing every single lesson. So checking for knowledge, checking for understanding, checking for gaps. One of the hardest things that teachers take on is the difference between you've taught it, but that doesn't mean that they've learnt it. Just because you as a teacher have done it doesn't matter. If the students haven't learnt it, or 3 of the students haven't learnt it, even if it's because they were talking during the lesson, you still have to fill the gap for them before they move on. So let's look now at how we can see what knowledge or skills the students have got during a lesson, low stakes. What we do then is low stakes quizzes. Just pop in a question to see what they know. If you make that question really easy, like who understands this, it's meaningless. Asking a student if they understand something, meaningless. They need to prove it, show you. If you give a true or false, 70% as a decimal is 0.07, true, false. Well, they've got a 50-50 chance. So you still aren't well informed whether they know it or not. If you give them 4 choices and say, which of the following is 88% as a decimal? Is it 8.8, 0.8, 0.88, 0.088? Now all of a sudden it's not a guess. Now all of a sudden they have to do something. It's a 1 in 4 chance it's a guess, but they could be asked to explain to the person next to them. And you know whether students have understood converting decimals, percentages into decimals. Here comes the important bit. Once you've found out who can do it and who can't do it, you're not allowed to just carry on regardless. You have to do something now. You have to give the students that can do it their next sequence of learning. And the students that can't do it, you have to give them scaffolding to get to their next part of learning. Finding out what they know is so that you can do something. It isn't just for interest's sake. What knowledge and skills do students have after a lesson or after a topic? This can be an end of topic test and turn into a summative assessment, but it can be a well-structured plenary, an applied question, a problem to solve that uses a lot of the ideas that you've been doing today, yesterday, this week, in the last 2 weeks. You have to keep doing that regularly, otherwise you've got gaps in their knowledge, and then they can't make the schema. They can't connect all those pieces of learning which will enable them to access applied deep learning. For some people, I know that this is going to be tricky because this means that you're going to have to plan more than one thing going on in your lesson. For me, that's a basic gauge that I have when I come into a classroom and I look if all the children are doing exactly the same thing with no scaffolding. My assumption is there's no assessment for learning. To try to give teachers the benefit of the doubt, what I'll do is have a look at books and see if I might have just popped in when there was none, but the rest of the learning, all the books look a little bit different. Some have got more detailed information, some have got more structure, some of the questions are more open-ended. And then I can see that assessment for learning is actually the natural way, and I've just missed it on this moment when I popped in. There's lots to take in there. There are lots of techniques. If this has refreshed your memory as to what assessment for learning should look like, and you've forgotten to do it, you've forgotten the value of it, and this has motivated you to sort it out again, then that's absolutely great. And if you need support and help with that, you obviously just need to ask, and all of that help will be found. If this is new to you and you've missed it for whatever reason and you have a gap in your knowledge, again, you just have to communicate that and the right support will be put there for you. If you want people to look at your lesson and say, I think this is assessment for learning, but I want to see if I'm using it effectively, then that would be a great thing to do. My last moment's takeaway is to refer back to what I said at the beginning, which is that the method you use for assessment for learning is not assessment for learning in itself. I am a huge fan of the mini whiteboard because that method of assessing their learning, I find really quick, really easy. They can write on the board, leave it by the side while I circulate a room. I can check what people have written. I can get everyone to hold it up at the same time. But using a mini whiteboard is not assessment for learning. It is the tool you use for a well-mastered question. Remember as well that assessment for learning really shouldn't be done in those last 30 seconds of a lesson. When it was first brought in, it was all this stuff. All students are going to do this at the end of the lesson because they want to leave the lesson. So that is not a gauge. Put your hand up if you understand this is not a gauge of understanding. It has to be discussed, written, short question, long question, showing you that they have a conceptual understanding and they are ready for the next step. That overwhelming feeling that you can't manage all these different tasks, you've already sequenced your learning. They need to know this, then this, then this. And for the ones that then can, they can go on to do this. All you have to do now is identify who's where. You've already got the tasks ready for the next piece of learning. And if students are missing knowledge here, they just need that scaffolding so that we can get the same task, the same high aspiration, but just put all the support in place to make sure students can get there. That might look like sneak peek sheets, that might look like word maps, that might look like self-marked model answers. And that is all adaptive teaching. And that will be the topic of another GFM talk, I'm sure. Thank you ever so much for listening to this one. And as I said at the beginning, please make sure as many people listen as possible. Then we've all got the same amount of knowledge and we can all work hard and drive in the same direction. Thank you.